Have you ever wondered how far someone can go when the odds are completely stacked against them? Imagine waking up every day in a world that tells you you're not enough and still finding the strength to prove everyone wrong. This is the story of a man who turned his failures into stepping stones, who transformed rejection into fuel, and who redefined what it truly means to succeed. Let's go back to the early 1980s, to a small, rundown neighborhood in Detroit. This is where our story begins, in a place where broken dreams seem to outnumber the streetlights. The man at the heart of this tale, James Carter, was born into a family that barely scraped by. His father worked double shifts at a factory, while his mother juggled 3 part-time jobs just to keep the electricity on. Their house was tiny, the roof leaked when it rained, and dinner was often whatever they could afford that week. James wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't the kid who aced math tests or dazzled teachers with his brilliance. In fact, his report cards were littered with C's and D's, and his teachers labeled him average. But there was something about James, something no one could measure in grades or test scores. He had grit. At 14, James discovered his passion for running. It wasn't about winning races or medals. It was the feeling of freedom, of leaving everything behind as his feet pounded the pavement. He would wake up before dawn, strap on his worn-out sneakers, and run miles before school. He wasn't the fastest, but he didn't stop. One day, during a school track meet, he overheard a coach laughing, saying, "That Carter kid? He'll never make it. He doesn't have what it takes." Those words burned into James's mind. He could have given up right there, but instead, he made a decision. He would prove them wrong. James started training harder than anyone else. He didn't have access to a fancy gym or professional trainers. He used what he had, the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, old tires for agility drills, and a sheer determination that couldn't be bought. By the time he was 17, James started winning local races. He wasn't the best yet, but he was getting noticed. College scouts began to show up, but they still doubted him. "He's good," they'd say, "but not good enough for a scholarship." James applied to over a dozen schools, and every single one rejected him. It would have been easy to give up. Most people would have, but James wasn't most people. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, he wrote a letter to every coach who had rejected him. In that letter, he didn't beg for a chance. Instead, he outlined his goals, his training regimen, and his undying commitment to improve. Weeks later, one coach responded. It wasn't a top-tier university. It was a small community college in Ohio. The coach said, "I'm not offering you a scholarship, but if you're willing to work harder than anyone else, you have a spot on my team." James packed his bags and left for Ohio with nothing but a second-hand suitcase and his determination. The transition wasn't easy. He was competing against athletes who were faster, stronger, and better trained. But James had something they didn't: a relentless drive. His mornings started at 4:30 a.m. with grueling workouts, followed by hours of practice, classes, and part-time jobs to pay for his tuition. He wasn't just running to win. He was running for survival, for a future that seemed impossible. And then, during his second year, something incredible happened. During a regional track meet, James shattered the school record for the 10,000 meters. His performance caught the attention of national coaches, and suddenly, the kid from Detroit who was once told he wasn't good enough was being scouted by major universities. But James wasn't done proving himself. 1 year later, James transferred to a Division I university with a full athletic scholarship. It was everything he had dreamed of, but the pressure was immense. Competing at this level was like stepping into a different world. The athletes were faster, the stakes were higher, and the competition was relentless. James quickly realized that talent alone wouldn't cut it. He needed to push himself harder than ever. While others trained for 2 hours, James trained for 4. When his teammates rested, James was analyzing footage of his races, identifying every mistake, every inefficiency. He became obsessed with improvement, not just physically, but mentally. But life wasn't done testing him. During his junior year, James suffered a devastating injury, a stress fracture in his left leg. The doctors told him he'd be out for at least 6 months, possibly longer. For an athlete, that kind of news feels like a death crushed. For weeks, he struggled with self-doubt. Was this it? Was his dream over? The thought of losing everything he had worked so hard for was unbearable. But then James remembered the coach's words when he first arrived at college. Your limits are defined by your mindset, not your circumstances. James decided that if he couldn't run, he would find another way to train. He spent hours in the pool doing aqua jogging to maintain his endurance. He worked on his upper body strength, studied techniques, and meditated to strengthen his focus. While his teammates thought he was out of the game, James was quietly preparing for his comeback. By the time he was cleared to run again, James wasn't just back, he was better. His resilience and determination became the stuff of legend on campus. During his senior year, he not only led his team to a national championship, but also broke a 15-year-old record in the 5,000 meters. But James's story didn't end there. After graduating, he was faced with another decision: pursue a professional running career or give back to the community that had shaped him. James chose both. He began training for the Olympics while also starting a program for underprivileged kids in Detroit. He called it Run for Hope, a mentorship and athletic training program designed to inspire kids to dream bigger than their circumstances. James would often tell them, "Your past doesn't define your future. What you do today does." Years later, James stood on the Olympic podium with a gold medal around his neck. The world saw a champion, but James saw something else. Every early morning run, every rejection letter, every setback that had brought him to this moment. And when a reporter asked him, "What's your secret to success?" James smiled and said, "The secret is simple. Never let anyone else write your story. That's your job." James's Olympic triumph wasn't just a personal victory. It was a beacon of hope for countless people who had followed his journey. He became a symbol of resilience, someone who showed the world that greatness isn't born. It's forged through relentless effort, unshakable belief, and the courage to stand back up after every fall. But James wasn't content to stop at his own success. He believed that true greatness comes from lifting others up. After the Olympics, he expanded his Run for Hope program into a nationwide initiative. Schools across the country adopted his training and mentorship curriculum, and James personally visited dozens of communities to share his story. In one memorable speech at a high school in Chicago, he stood before an auditorium packed with students. Many of them came from backgrounds similar to his: poverty, broken homes, and a system that seemed rigged against them. James began his speech with a question: "How many of you have been told you're not good enough?" Almost every hand went up. James paused, letting the weight of their collective struggles fill the room. Then he said, "I was told that too, over and over again. But let me tell you something, other people's opinions are not your destiny. Every single one of you has a fire inside you. The world will try to put it out, but you have to protect it. You have to feed it. And one day that fire will light up the world." The room erupted in applause, and from that moment on, James became more than an athlete. He became a movement. He wrote a best-selling book titled Against the Wind, where he detailed his journey and the lessons he'd learned along the way. The book wasn't just about running. It was about life, about overcoming adversity, and about finding your purpose. It became a source of inspiration for millions. James also took on roles as a motivational speaker, traveling the globe to share his message. From corporate boardrooms to small-town community centers, his words resonated with people from all walks of life. He would often remind his audiences, "Success isn't about how fast you run or how high you climb. It's about how many times you get back up when you fall." But James never lost sight of his roots. He continued to live in Detroit, using his platform to advocate for better opportunities in underprivileged communities. He partnered with local organizations to build sports facilities, create scholarship programs, and provide resources for young athletes who couldn't afford equipment or training. As the years went by, James's legacy grew. He inspired a generation of runners who saw him not just as a champion, but as a role model. Many of the kids from his Run for Hope program went on to achieve incredible things. Some became professional athletes, others became doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs. They all credited James with teaching them the power of perseverance and self-belief. One day, while visiting his childhood neighborhood, James stood in front of the small house where his journey had begun. The roof had been repaired, the walls painted, and the yard was filled with kids playing. It was a stark contrast to the broken down home he remembered. A young boy from the neighborhood ran up to him and said, "Mr. Carter, I want to be just like you when I grow up." James knelt down, looked the boy in the eye, and said, "Don't be like me. Be better, dream bigger, and never let anyone tell you what you can't do." The boy smiled and nodded, clutching a small notebook he carried everywhere. James couldn't help but see a younger version of himself in the boy's eager eyes. It was moments like these that were why he fought so hard, not just for himself, but for the countless other to see that impossible was just a word. As James walked through the neighborhood, memories flooded back. He passed the old track where he used to train alone before sunrise, the corner store where he worked part-time to buy his first pair of running shoes, and the school where he was once told he wouldn't amount to much. Each step was a testament to how far he had come, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Later that evening, James hosted a community gathering at the newly built recreation center that his foundation had funded. Hundreds of people showed up, families, aspiring athletes, and even those who didn't know much about running but knew about James's story. He stood on the small stage, looking out at the crowd. There were grandparents holding toddlers, teenagers with smartphones capturing every moment, and parents who whispered to their kids, "That's James Carter. He's the reason we're here today." James began to speak, his voice steady and warm. "When I was a kid, this neighborhood was my entire world, and for a long time, it felt like that world was trying to keep me small. I was told to stay in my lane, to lower my expectations, to settle for what I had. But I couldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. I knew there was something more out there, even if I couldn't see it yet." He paused, scanning the room. "But here's the truth. I didn't get here alone. My journey wasn't just about running races. It was about every person who believed in me, every friend who lifted me up, every coach who challenged me, and every stranger who said, 'You can do this.' And that's why I'm standing here today, not as someone who made it, but as someone who wants to remind you that you can make it too." A wave of applause swept through the crowd, but James raised his hand to quiet them. "I want you to do something for me tonight," he continued. "When you leave here, I want you to write down one thing you've been too afraid to chase. Maybe it's starting a business, going back to school, running a marathon, or even just standing up for yourself. Whatever it is, write it down. And tomorrow, take one small step toward making it happen. Just one step, because that's how it starts, with a single step." The room fell silent as his words sank in. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped, and all that existed was the unspoken bond between James and his audience. As the event wrapped up, James stayed behind to talk to anyone who wanted to share their dreams, their struggles, or just a quick thank you. He listened intently to every story, offering words of encouragement and advice. One woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She explained that her teenage son had been struggling with depression and had nearly dropped out of school. But after hearing James's story, he had started running and had found a sense of purpose. "You saved him," she said, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "No, ma'am. He saved himself. I just gave him a reason to believe he could." As James drove home that night, he reflected on the ripple effect of his journey. He had started as a boy with a dream, running alone in the dark. Now his story was lighting the path for others, proving that even in the face of adversity, greatness was possible. And in his heart, James knew this was only the beginning. The years that followed solidified James Carter's legacy as not just a champion athlete, but a champion of hope and resilience. His influence extended beyond the track as his foundation grew into a global movement. Programs inspired by Run for Hope were launched in cities around the world: Los Angeles, Mumbai, Nairobi, and beyond, each one igniting the dreams of young people who felt trapped by their circumstances. But James never stopped challenging himself. Despite his growing fame, he remained deeply committed to pushing the boundaries of what was possible. At the age of 35, when most athletes were retiring, James announced he would attempt something unprecedented: a 100-mile ultramarathon through Death Valley, one of the harshest terrains on the planet. The announcement was met with skepticism. Critics said he was too old, that the conditions were too dangerous, that even seasoned ultramarathoners had failed to complete the course. But for James, this wasn't just about proving he could endure. It was about showing the world that limits are meant to be challenged. In the months leading up to the race, James trained with an intensity that even his closest friends found astonishing. He ran in extreme heat, carrying weights to simulate the brutal conditions of Death Valley. He consulted with survival experts, studied hydration strategies, and even trained his mind through visualization techniques to prepare for the mental toll of running 100 miles in relentless heat. The day of the race arrived, and temperatures soared to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Dozens of runners lined up at the starting point, each one knowing the risks they faced. As the race began, James paced himself, his focus unshakable. The first 50 miles were grueling, but manageable. James relied on everything he had learned, his training, his discipline, his mental toughness. But as the sun reached its peak and the air became almost unbearable to breathe, the real challenge began. Around mile 70, James's body started to rebel. His muscles cramped, his vision blurred, and every step felt like an impossible task. He could hear the whispers of doubt creeping into his mind. "You can't do this. Just stop. No one will blame you." But then, James remembered why he was doing this. He thought of the boy in Detroit who ran on cracked sidewalks. He thought of the mother who said he had saved her son. He thought of every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. And he kept going. At mile 90, James collapsed. His support team rushed to his side, urging him to stop. But James refused. With tears streaming down his face and every fiber of his being screaming for him to quit, he stood back up. "Not today," he whispered to himself. "Not today." The final 10 miles were a blur of pain and determination. As James approached the finish line, a crowd of spectators erupted in cheers. News cameras captured the moment as James Carter, the man who had defied every odd, crossed the finish line and collapsed into his team's arms. The next day, headlines around the world proclaimed his victory. But for James, the race wasn't about the glory. It was about the message that no matter how impossible something seems, the human spirit is capable of extraordinary things. In the days following the race, James's story went viral. His image, exhausted yet triumphant at the finish line, became a symbol of unyielding resilience. Social media exploded with messages of admiration, and people from all walks of life shared how his journey had inspired them to face their own challenges. But James, ever humble, redirected the spotlight to a deeper message. During a televised interview, the host asked him, "James, what's next for you? After conquering Death Valley, is there anything left to prove?" James smiled, his calm demeanor capturing the audience's attention. "It's not about proving anything anymore. It's about reminding people, especially the ones who feel invisible, that they matter, that their fight, their journey has value. My race in Death Valley wasn't just for me. It was for everyone who's ever felt like giving up." That moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in James's life. He shifted his focus from personal achievements to global advocacy. He launched a documentary series titled The Human Spirit, where he traveled the world highlighting stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. One episode featured a young woman in Brazil who had started a community library in her impoverished neighborhood using nothing but discarded books. Another showcased a man in Kenya who built a solar-powered water pump to provide clean drinking water for his village. Through these stories, James emphasized a universal truth. Greatness isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's found in the quiet acts of courage and kindness that ripple outwards, changing lives. Meanwhile, his foundation continued to grow. James worked with international organizations to bring sports and education programs to underserved communities. He often said, "It's not just about running, it's about running toward a better future." As James entered his 40s, his influence only deepened. He became a sought-after advisor for nonprofits and governments, helping design programs that empowered marginalized communities. Despite his growing responsibilities, he remained hands-on, personally mentoring young athletes and activists. One of the most touching moments of his later years came during the opening ceremony of the Olympics in his hometown of Detroit. The city, which had once been a symbol of decay and struggle, had undergone a renaissance, thanks in part to initiatives James had championed. As he stood on the stage, now a global icon, He looked out at the crowd and said, "Detroit taught me how to dream. It taught me how to fight. And it taught me that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes. To everyone watching, remember, your story isn't over. It's just beginning." The audience erupted in applause, and as the fireworks lit up the night sky, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had run countless races, but this moment felt like the culmination of everything he had worked for, a legacy not of medals, but of hope. Years later, as an older James walked through a park with his grandson, the boy looked up at him and asked, "Grandpa, why do people call you a hero?" James chuckled softly and replied, "I'm no hero, kiddo. I just refuse to stop running." And with that, James Carter's story became more than a tale of success. It became a testament to the power of perseverance, a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As James walked through the park with his grandson, a group of runners passed by. They slowed down when they recognized him, waving and calling out, "Thank you for inspiring us." James nodded humbly, his grandson looking up at him with wide eyes. "Grandpa, do you ever miss running?" the boy asked, tugging at James's hand. James smiled. "I still run, just in a different way. I run with my heart now, with every person I help, every story I tell, every life I touch. The race never really ends, it just changes." The boy seemed to think about this for a moment before asking, "Will I be able to run like you someday?" James stopped and crouched down to meet his grandson's gaze. "You don't need to run like me. You have your own race to run, and you'll be amazing at it as long as you never stop believing in yourself." The boy grinned, and they continued their walk, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. As James grew older, his impact only deepened. He became a mentor to world leaders, an advocate for global education reform, and a champion for mental health awareness. He used his platform to destigmatize conversations about failure and resilience, reminding people that setbacks were merely stepping stones to success. One of his most ambitious projects was the Global Dream Initiative, which aimed to provide opportunities for underprivileged youth worldwide. The initiative included scholarships, mentorship programs, and access to sports and arts education. James believed that every child deserved the chance to dream, and he poured his heart and resources into making that a reality. During a keynote speech at the United Nations, James addressed an audience of world leaders, activists, and changemakers. "Our world is full of untapped potential," he said, his voice steady and passionate. "Every child born into poverty, every young person told they'll never amount to anything. That's a dream waiting to be unleashed. If we invest in them, if we believe in them, we're not just changing their lives, we're changing the world." The room erupted in a standing ovation, and James's words resonated far beyond the walls of the UN. His speech became a rallying cry for a new era of global collaboration and hope. As the years passed, James's story was immortalized in books, films, and even a museum exhibit dedicated to his life and legacy. But despite the accolades, he remained the same humble man who had started his journey on a cracked Detroit sidewalk. In his final years, James spent his time surrounded by family, his grandson often asking him to retell the stories of his greatest races. One day, as they sat on the porch together, the boy asked, "Grandpa, if you could do it all over again, would you?" James leaned back in his chair, looking out at the setting sun. After a moment, he said, "I wouldn't change a thing. Every stumble, every setback, every challenge, it all led me here, and here is exactly where I want to be." When James passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92, the world mourned the loss of a legend. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, celebrating his life not just as an athlete, but as a beacon of hope and humanity. In Detroit, thousands gathered for a memorial run in his honor. People of all ages and backgrounds came together, running through the streets where James had begun his journey. At the finish line, a plaque was unveiled, bearing his most famous words, "Your race is your own. Run it with heart, run it with courage, and never stop." And so James Carter's legacy lived on, not just in records or medals, but in the countless lives he had touched, the dreams he had sparked, and the hope he had instilled in a world that needed it most. Years after James Carter's passing, his legacy continued to grow, transcending generations. The Run for Hope Foundation, now a global institution, expanded its reach into new territories. war-torn regions, refugee camps, and remote villages where hope seemed like a distant dream. The foundation launched a new initiative, the James Carter Academy, dedicated to nurturing young leaders and change-makers. The academy was more than just a school. It was a sanctuary for those who had faced unimaginable hardships. Children from every corner of the world came together to learn, dream, and build a future inspired by James's ideals. One of the academy's brightest students was a young girl named Amara. Born in a small village in sub-Saharan Africa, she had lost her family to conflict and had grown up believing that her life would never extend beyond survival. But when she joined the academy, everything changed. Amara found herself captivated by James's story, watching documentaries about his life and reading every book written about him. She often stood in front of his statue at the academy, whispering her dreams to the bronze figure, as if seeking his guidance. "I want to change the world too," she would say, "but I don't know how." One day, while attending a leadership seminar at the academy, Amara was invited to speak about her aspirations. Nervously, she stood before a room filled with students, teachers, and visiting dignitaries. "My name is Amara," she began, her voice trembling. "I come from a place where dreams are a luxury, where hope feels like a lie. But James Carter's story taught me something, that even in the darkest moments, we can find light. And now I want to be that light for others." The room erupted in applause, and from that moment on, Amara became a rising star within the academy. She spearheaded community projects, helped establish a library in her village, and even led a campaign to provide clean water to neighboring communities. Years later, Amara stood on the same stage at the United Nations where James had once spoken. She was now a global advocate for education and equality, her voice echoing the same passion and determination that had defined James's journey. "James Carter showed us that one person can ignite a movement," she declared. "He ran his race, and now it's our turn to carry the torch. Together, we can create a world where no dream is too big, no challenge too great, and no one is left behind." As Amara spoke, James' grandson sat in the audience, tears in his eyes. He had inherited his grandfather's love for storytelling and was now a filmmaker, documenting the lives of those inspired by James's legacy. Watching Amara, he realized that his grandfather's dream had grown far beyond anything James could have imagined. After the speech, Amara approached him. "Your grandfather changed my life," she said, shaking his hand. "And now I want to do the same for others." "You already are," he replied, smiling. Together, they stood under a mural of James Carter, depicting him mid-stride with his iconic words painted alongside, "Run your race and the world will follow." And so, the ripple effect of James's life continued, proving that a single story, a single act of perseverance, could inspire countless others to dream, to believe, and to run their own race. As the world continued to embrace the legacy of James Carter, his story became more than just a tale of triumph. It became a movement, a call to action for everyone who had ever felt like giving up. And just like that, we arrive at the end of this incredible journey. If James's story has touched your heart, inspired you to push through your own challenges, or reminded you that hope is never truly lost, then we invite you to be part of our community. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Like and share this video to spread the message that no matter where we come from, we can all run our race and change the world in the process. Thank you for watching, and remember, your race has just begun. Keep running.